There are moments in life when someone walks away, not because you weren't enough, but because facing the depth of what you offered required a level of emotional courage they didn't yet have. Avoidant people don't always leave loudly. Sometimes they drift, detach, and choose comfort over connection. But what feels like relief in the moment often turns into something much heavier over time: regret. Avoidance is often mistaken for strength, but in reality, it's a carefully constructed shield designed to protect a person from discomfort, not to empower them to grow. When someone leans into avoidance, they're not demonstrating control over their emotions, they're demonstrating fear of them. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Because true strength requires you to stay present in moments that feel uncertain, to face conversations that feel uncomfortable, and to hold space for emotions that don't always make you feel in control. Avoidance does the opposite. It pulls a person away the moment things start to feel real. An avoidant person becomes incredibly skilled at convincing themselves that distance equals clarity. They tell themselves that stepping back is the mature choice, that detaching is a form of self-protection, that needing less makes them stronger. But what they don't realize is that this pattern doesn't eliminate emotional complexity. It delays it. It pushes it into the background, where it quietly grows stronger over time. Because when you avoid something meaningful, you don't actually escape it. You carry it with you. And this is where the illusion begins to crack. On the surface, avoidance can look like independence. It can look like someone who isn't easily shaken, someone who doesn't get too attached, someone who can walk away without looking back. But underneath that image is a constant effort to maintain distance, to suppress the instinct to connect, to override the natural desire for closeness. That's not freedom, that's restriction. Real strength isn't about how quickly you can disconnect. It's about how deeply you can stay when things become uncertain. It's about being able to say, "This scares me, but I'm willing to understand it," instead of, "This scares me, so I'm going to shut it down." Avoidance chooses the second option every time. Not because it's the right choice, but because it feels safer in the moment. The problem is, what feels safe now often becomes heavy later. Because every avoided conversation becomes a question that never got answered. Every suppressed emotion becomes a feeling that was never fully processed. Every moment of distance becomes a gap that slowly widens between what someone experienced and what they allowed themselves to acknowledge. And over time, that gap turns into something difficult to ignore. They start to feel a quiet restlessness they can't quite explain. They find themselves thinking about moments they once dismissed. They begin to question decisions that once felt so certain. And it's in those moments that they start to realize something uncomfortable. What they thought was strength was actually protection, and what they protected themselves from may have been exactly what they needed to grow. Because strength isn't found in avoiding emotional risk. It's found in facing it, learning from it, and allowing it to shape you into someone more open, not more guarded. They often convince themselves that what they're feeling is peace, when in reality, it's simply the absence of emotional intensity. There's a difference between true inner calm and emotional shutdown. But to someone who has learned to associate closeness with discomfort, that difference can become blurred. When they step away from a connection that required presence, communication, and vulnerability, they experience a kind of quiet that feels relieving at first. No more difficult conversations, no more emotional responsibility, no more moments where they have to explain what they feel or why they feel it. And in that silence, they tell themselves, "This is better. This is what I needed." But what they're actually experiencing isn't peace, it's distance. Real peace doesn't come from removing depth, it comes from being able to handle it. It comes from knowing you can sit in the middle of emotional complexity without needing to escape it. But for an avoidant person, depth feels overwhelming, so distance feels like relief. They mistake the absence of pressure for emotional stability, not realizing that they've simply removed the very thing that was asking them to grow. Because genuine connection will always ask something of you. It asks you to listen when it's easier to shut down. It asks you to communicate when it's easier to withdraw. It asks you to stay present when your instinct is to pull away. And if you're not used to that level of engagement, it can feel like too much. So they choose distance and label it as peace. They settle into routines that don't challenge them emotionally. They engage in interactions that stay on the surface. They avoid situations that might require them to open up or be vulnerable. And for a while, everything feels manageable, predictable, controlled. But here's the part they don't expect. Over time, that emotional distance begins to feel empty. Because while they've removed discomfort, they've also removed depth. The conversations become lighter but less meaningful. The connections become easier but less fulfilling. There's no tension, but there's also no real intimacy. And slowly, almost quietly, they begin to notice that something is missing. It's not loud at first, it doesn't demand attention. It's just a subtle awareness that what they're experiencing lacks the richness they once had. That the peace they chose doesn't carry the same warmth, the same connection, the same sense of being truly understood. And that's when the confusion starts, because they did what they thought was right. They avoided what felt overwhelming. They protected themselves from emotional discomfort. So why does it feel like something important is gone? The answer is simple but not easy to accept. They didn't create peace, they created distance. And distance can never replace connection. Eventually, they begin to recognize that real peace isn't about avoiding emotional waves. It's about learning how to navigate them. It's about being able to stay when things feel uncertain, to communicate when things feel unclear, to remain open even when it feels risky. But by the time that realization fully settles in, they're often left facing the quiet truth that what they walked away from wasn't chaos. It was something real. At the moment they walked away, it felt like relief. It felt like they were escaping something that demanded too much from them, too much emotion, too much presence, too much vulnerability. They told themselves they were choosing freedom, that they were regaining control, that they were better off without something that felt so consuming. And for a while, that story holds. It protects them from having to question their decision. But what they don't realize is that you don't truly understand the value of something meaningful when you're running from it. You understand it when it's no longer there. Because once the intensity fades and the distance settles in, something unexpected begins to happen. The very things they once labeled as too much start to feel rare. The depth of your conversations, the way you paid attention, the emotional presence you brought, those things don't easily show up again in the same way. And as they move forward, trying to recreate that sense of connection elsewhere, they begin to notice a difference. Other interactions feel lighter, but also thinner, easier but less impactful. There's no pressure, but there's also no real pull. And slowly they begin to recognize that what they walked away from wasn't overwhelming. It was meaningful. And this is where the shift begins. Because what they once ran from starts to turn into something they crave. Not in a loud, immediate way, but in quiet realizations. In moments where they catch themselves thinking about how you understood them without needing everything explained. In situations where they wish someone else would show up with the same consistency, the same depth, the same emotional awareness. In conversations that feel incomplete because they lack the substance you once brought so naturally. It's in those moments that the truth starts to surface. They didn't leave because what you had was wrong. They left because they didn't know how to hold something that was right. And that's a difficult realization to sit with. Because it means accepting that the discomfort they felt wasn't a sign to walk away. It was a signal to grow. It means acknowledging that the connection they once saw as overwhelming was actually an opportunity to experience something deeper than what they were used to. But growth requires staying. Growth requires leaning in when your instinct tells you to pull back. And at the time, they weren't ready for that. So now, they sit on the other side of their decision, looking back with a different perspective. And what makes it even heavier is that they can't simply recreate what they lost. Because connection isn't just about finding someone new, it's about timing, readiness, and emotional availability. And what you offered came at a moment when they didn't have the capacity to receive it fully. That's why it lingers. That's why it becomes something they think about, something they measure other experiences against, something they quietly wish they had approached differently. Because the truth is, people don't crave what was ordinary. They crave what was real. And when someone walks away from something real before they're ready to understand it, they often spend far more time trying to find it again than they ever spent trying to keep it. At first, distractions do an excellent job of keeping everything buried. They fill the space with noise, with movement, with just enough stimulation to prevent any real reflection. A new routine, new people, constant activity, these things create the illusion that life is moving forward without any emotional weight attached to the past. And for a while it works. It keeps the mind occupied and the feelings distant. But distractions are temporary by nature. They rely on momentum. And the moment that momentum slows down, even slightly, the silence begins to return. It happens in small, almost unnoticeable ways at first. A quiet evening with nothing planned. a moment between conversations, a break in the usual rhythm of busyness. And in those gaps, something begins to surface, not all at once, but gradually. Because the truth doesn't need chaos to exist, it waits for stillness. And when that stillness arrives, the mind naturally starts to revisit what it once avoided. Thoughts that were pushed aside begin to come back, not as overwhelming waves, but as persistent questions. Did I handle that the right way? Was I too quick to walk away? What was I really feeling at the time? These aren't dramatic realizations. They're quiet, but they carry weight. Because without distractions to suppress them, those thoughts have space to expand. They begin to connect with emotions that were never fully processed. Feelings that were dismissed as unnecessary or inconvenient start to reveal their depth. And what once felt like a clear, confident decision begins to feel more complex, more uncertain. This is where time plays its role. Time has a way of removing the emotional fog that exists in the moment of decision. When someone is caught in discomfort, their perspective is limited. They're focused on immediate relief, on escaping what feels overwhelming. But as time passes, that urgency fades, and with it, the justifications that once felt so convincing. What remains is clarity. And clarity can be uncomfortable when it reveals something different from what someone initially believed. They start to see the situation without the same emotional resistance. They begin to understand not just what happened, but why they reacted the way they did. They recognize patterns in themselves that they may not have been aware of before. The tendency to pull away when things get real, the instinct to protect rather than engage, the habit of choosing short-term comfort over long-term meaning. And with that awareness comes a quiet realization. The distractions didn't solve anything. They only delayed the moment of truth. Because no matter how far someone moves, or how busy they keep themselves, they can't outrun something that exists within them. The feelings, the memories, the unresolved emotions, they don't disappear. They wait. And when they finally rise to the surface, they often feel heavier than they would have in the beginning. Not because the situation changed, but because now there's distance to reflect on what was lost. There's perspective to see what was overlooked. There's time to recognize the depth of something that was once minimized. And that's the moment where avoidance no longer feels like relief. It feels like something unfinished. Regret doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock loudly or demand immediate attention. Instead, it settles in slowly, almost quietly, building its weight over time. At first, it's easy to ignore, just a passing thought, a fleeting memory, a brief moment of wondering, what if? But the more it's left unacknowledged, the more it begins to grow. Because regret isn't just about missing someone. It's about recognizing the truth of a situation when it's too late to respond to it in the same way. In the beginning, they may still hold on to their justifications. They remind themselves why they left, why it felt necessary, why it seemed like the right decision at the time. And those reasons can feel valid for a while. But as time moves forward and emotions settle, those justifications begin to lose their strength. What once felt certain starts to feel questionable. They begin to replay moments, not with the same mindset they had back then, but with a new perspective. They see things they didn't see before. They understand reactions they once dismissed. They start to realize that what they interpreted as pressure may have been care, that what they labeled as overwhelming may have simply been depth. And this shift is subtle but powerful. Because once someone begins to see the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. They can try to distract themselves again. They can try to push those thoughts away. But now there's awareness. And awareness has a way of cutting through denial. It doesn't allow the same comfort in avoidance that once existed. So the regret deepens. Not because they want it to, but because it's rooted in something real. It's rooted in the understanding that they had something meaningful in front of them and didn't fully recognize it at the time. It's rooted in the awareness that their decision wasn't entirely about logic. It was influenced by fear, by habit, by a need to protect themselves from emotional discomfort. And that realization carries weight. Because it's not just about losing a person, it's about confronting a version of themselves that wasn't ready, that wasn't open, that wasn't willing to take the emotional risk required to sustain something real. And that's a difficult truth to sit with. They may find themselves wanting to go back, to fix things, to say what they didn't say before. But regret often comes with timing that doesn't align with opportunity. By the time they fully understand what they lost, circumstances may have changed. The moment they once had may no longer exist in the same way. And that's where the heaviness truly sets in. Because now, it's not just a thought, it's a feeling that lingers. It shows up in quiet moments, in reflections, in comparisons that don't quite measure up. It stays with them not because they choose to hold on to it, but because it represents something unresolved within them. Something they didn't face when they had the chance. And the longer they sit with that truth, the clearer it becomes that regret isn't just about the past, it's a mirror. A reflection of what happens when fear is allowed to make decisions that require courage. And once that reflection becomes undeniable, it doesn't fade easily.